Beethoven's Spring Sonata for violin and piano, composed and published in 1801, was written at an interesting point in Beethoven's life. It was around this time that he came to the realization that he was experiencing hearing loss. Though it only really affected him in social situations, he wrote to many friends explaining his, quote, miserable life. After all, he was only about 30 years old at the time. Beethoven said this about the difficult task of telling people he was becoming deaf. Quote, if I had any other profession, it would be easier, but in my profession it is a terrible handicap, close quote. However, in the same letters he wrote to his friends about his deafness, he was also explaining his professional and financial successes. Some of Beethoven's past compositions and sonatas had brought about criticism for being too adventurous in harmonies and rhythms. Because of this, he made sure his Opus 24 No. 5 Sonata had a high level of listenability and an uncomplicated beauty that would appeal to critics and concertgoers alike. The nickname Spring was not given to the sonata by Beethoven himself, but it speaks to the flowing melodies and beautiful lines that sound like the dawn of a new spring. Though Beethoven quickly established himself as a keyboard virtuoso when he arrived in Vienna in 1792, he played both the violin and the piano as a youth in Germany and continued to study the violin for a while. The Naxos Glossary of Musical Terms says this about sonatas. Quote, duo sonatas, generally using a keyboard instrument and a melody instrument, developed to a form in which the keyboard assumed greater importance, with an optional accompaniment from a melody instrument. Greater degrees of equality between the two were achieved in the later violin sonatas of Mozart and the violin sonatas and cello sonatas of Beethoven. Close quote. This sonata shows how Beethoven was comfortable with both instruments, and they both have prominent voices in this sonata. He captures this equality between the two very well. The fourth movement of the sonata is in the form its name suggests, rondo. This simply means that the main theme is stated at the beginning of the movement and recurs throughout the movement. There are also little adventures in between the returns of the refrain with some minor key agitation. However, the sunny disposition of the overall F major key triumphs in the end. As stated, the main key area of the movement and the theme is F major. The primary theme uses a little bit of chromaticism and scalar motifs, making it difficult to determine a key area for a few measures. This can be seen as describing the name of the piece, Spring Sonata. The refrain sounds like it's growing, like a budding flower in spring. Interestingly, the theme, played by both the piano and the violin, lasts a balanced 8 bars in the piano, but the violin takes it further into a 10-bar phrase. Since this is in rondo form, Beethoven brings back this main theme 4 different times with some variations. The refrain is established in the beginning 18 measures, first in the piano and then in the violin. Here's a little bit of the piano playing this refrain. The second time it comes around, the violin adds 2 whole note flourishes, but otherwise the theme doesn't change much. For the third recurrence of the theme, however, the violin pizzicatos chords while the piano plays the melodic line 1 octave higher than in the last 2 themes. When the violin takes over, the piano is arpeggiating chords and triplets. There is more play happening between the 2 instruments. The last time the refrain appears, though, is the most playful by far. Variations on the melody and ways of playing the harmonies are sprinkled throughout the 4th theme. This is building excitement as the end of the movement and the piece near. Here's a little bit of the last refrain as played by the violin. One of the adventures from the theme is particularly interesting analytically. One intriguing aspect of it is the key area changes. Beethoven switches moods and keys very quickly within a few measures. It goes from C minor to C major then back to C minor. Before developing its way back to F major. This idea happens again later in the movement, going from E flat minor to E flat major, then transforming into the main development of the movement. One of the climaxes of the piece includes a copycat exchange between the piano and violin. The two instruments trade off playing driving triplets and a powerful minor melody. This excerpt is the highest point in this particular climax. The biggest climax of the piece lasts about 10 measures and then simmers down from there. Beethoven again changes keys in a short amount of time, a few times over, and uses chromaticism. He brilliantly built up tension, leading to the climax, with the various unsettled keys. One of the biggest climaxes actually happens at the very end of the movement and the piece. Beethoven brings a lot of energy to the final phrases of the piece after a chorale-like piano solo. As for the climax, the violin starts with a flowing melody being driven by 16th notes in the piano. The melody becomes more and more buoyant and active, and the last few measures are a playful exchange between the two instruments, building excitement with triplets. Though Beethoven began to lose his hearing at the time he wrote his Spring Sonata, it certainly didn't affect his composing capabilities. The high level of listenability of this sonata makes it particularly beautiful to the ear. This sonata definitely lives up to its nickname, Spring, as Beethoven uses flowing melodies and little bits of chromaticism to paint a picture of a beautiful spring day. Beethoven had definitely found his voice by this point in his career.